I am so excited. You're listening to the James Altucher Show on YouTube. You're going to learn all about peak performance from today's greatest influencers and many of my heroes, and you're going to learn how you can get there as well. I upload a new video every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday. So please don't forget to subscribe, click on the bell notification, and don't miss a thing. So, very special podcast today. We have Amy Morin. Amy, this is your second time on the podcast. Third time. The first one was for 13 things mentally strong people don't do, and your other book, 13 Strong Things Mentally Strong Parents Don't Do. Am I getting the title right? Because there's like a double negative in there. And then you're about to have, or by the end of this year, you're going to have 13 things mentally strong women don't do, which I'm really looking forward to, and we'll have you back on the podcast for that. And then the second time you were on the podcast, you described this amazing way you and your husband basically started from scratch a business from home that paid the bills and made money, and anybody could start from their home. And it was a great episode, totally different from the other episode. I mean, both were great, but they're different topics. And now you're on, in part, I'm thanking you for coming on, because in part you're going to interview me a little bit, but I actually have one or two questions for you first.
Okay, sure.
I've been seeing you quoted in lots of articles lately. Like, it seems like when you write articles, other people quote you. Did you know that was happening?
Yeah, it's interesting. I never know where it's going to end up. Somebody emailed me this week and said, "Oh, a great article in the newspaper." And they sent me a picture of the newspaper. And I said, "What paper is it?" He said it was the Tampa Bay Times. I had no idea. But sometimes it gets syndicated, but sometimes it also just people quote me and they don't necessarily tell me that it gets quoted.
Yeah, like I think the other day I saw an article, I think it was by a prior podcast guest here, Nell Scoville, writing about David Letterman, and how when she worked at Letterman and now there wasn't that many women working for David Letterman's show, and even now in his new show. And she quoted you about women in the workforce.
Oh.
And then I read another article, and I just see your name pop up. It was about when you should work for free. And you were quoted. I don't know if you saw that article. Did you see that article? It quoted another article you wrote about when you should do things for free.
I think I got a Google alert that said I was quoted in some article about that topic.
Yeah, and you say if it's for exposure, for resume building. What were the other two things?
Great question. I have no idea at this point.
I'm gonna look it up, because it was specifically how she quoted you. Because I think this is an interesting topic. All the time, of course, we're all asked to do things for free.
Right.
And we're all given the bullshit excuse, "Oh, this will be great exposure for you." So I am curious how you identify, where the line is on these different things. So, okay, you're quoted in an article on Inc. Amy Morin writes that there are only 4 times you should work for free: when you earn exposure, when you expand on your real life experience, when you gain a valuable addition to your resume, and when it's for a cause that you believe in. So a cause that you believe in, I'll take that for granted. A lot of people, volunteer and so on. When you earn exposure, like when I've run a business, so many times companies would say to me, "Oh, this will be great exposure when people see you did work for us." Like, where do you draw the line? Because that's the most common way people try to get you to do stuff for free.
Yeah, I think you have to be really careful, because the number of things you do for free for exposure that will actually help you is pretty slim to none. So I think if it's something that will look good on your resume, like if you give a Google talk, Google doesn't pay you, but you get to put that on your resume that you spoke at Google.
Right. Like, have you given a Google talk?
Yeah,
So have I.
right.
We did it for free.
Right. Same with TEDx. It wasn't, I knew that I wasn't going to get paid for it, but at the same
just
time,
something
it
you
was
could say.
free. But it's got me millions of views on YouTube, so it was worth it. But so I think it's really about figuring out what kind of exposure. 'Cause so many people, I think, are like, "Oh, take my picture for free and then I'll put it on my website, but I'll tell everybody that you took that photo." Well, if it's like billsblog.com and nobody reads his blog anyway, having your photo credit isn't going to actually bring you business if you live in Kansas and nobody in Kansas reads this website. So I think it's really important to find out what's the exposure. Or as a speaker, people will say, there'll be so many people in the audience and that will build your brand or help you with exposure. Well, who's in the audience, and is it actually going to lead to something new? Most times I think not.
Yeah, and also kind of related to this is if you're a small business and another small business wants you to do a service for them, and they say, "Oh, we don't have any, we're raising money, we'll give you a little piece of equity." That's the same as free,
Right.
but people don't realize it because it sounds like, oh my gosh, if they're a big, and they're saying we're the next Uber,
Right.
you could get. I've never made money getting paid in equity for anything, and I've done it. I've done free. I've done every stupid thing you could do for free, including working for equity, and it never works.
Yeah, and early on when I started, there were mental health apps and mental health websites and software, and all these people would ask me that, "Do you want to do it? Do this for us, or help us with this project, and we'll give you a piece of equity." And the first few times, I thought, "Oh, that sounds great," because it could go on and do something. And then that realization sunk in that it's probably not going to be worth any money. If they don't want to pay me up front, then I probably don't want to spend my time doing it. If
Yeah.
it's
Yeah, so there's like so like, I would add like 2 things or 2 ideas to your list. One is if it's instantaneous or fast, I'll do something for free. So
right,
if somebody says, "Can you write a blurb for my book?" and I read the book and I like it, I'm happy to do that for free
hmm
because then your name is on every book and it is kind of there's definite exposure there if the book does well and it didn't take you that much time anyway if the book doesn't do well. And then I think for the exposure, it's so easy to rationalize in your head, "Oh, yeah, this is good exposure." You should sort of write the rules of where the line is for exposure. Like, will a million people see this?
right,
Or, if you have to kind of write the criteria in advance and not break your rules.
yes.
So that's really important. Have the discipline to not break your rules.
Yes, I think that's huge because it's so tempting in the moment to say yes when somebody asks you to do something, but to have those rules and stick to them.
Yeah. Like like I'm sure like when you write these articles for ink, you're probably doing them some of these articles are for free. I don't know about ink, but for some of these publications, but that's pretty good exposure. It gets you quoted in all these places. It builds relationships with lots of editors who move on to do other things. So that kind of stuff. And it's quick to do. It's quick to write
Right.
an article if you're used to kind of churning out articles. I don't say churning in a bad way, but I write articles. We both write articles on demand.
Right.
So, what other rules would you add to that now? Because I think this is such a the notion of working for free is such an important one.
Yeah, and sometimes you can directly tell what the uh your return is on your investment of your time, but I think sometimes you just never know too. Sometimes I'll have an article that goes somewhere and somebody will then hire me down the road and you never really know how all of that happened, but I think it's just really important to pay attention to your time, where it's going, and how much of an investment you're putting in and what you expect to get back.
And I guess it's like you said, like Google or TEDx, you would do for free because then it's not so much that your talk might be great or that the audience might be great is that you're associating yourself with a brand that is considered super high quality.
Right.
So then you get it signals that you're also super high quality. So that's it's not just a resume thing. It brings up status. So like if Barack Obama came to you and said, "Hey, will you mow my lawn and have coffee with me for free?" I would say yes to that.
Right.
And then I could say, special advisor to Barack Obama one day.
Right. Yeah, and, I had made that rule. I said, "I'm not gonna speak for free anymore unless it's a charity or cause that I really believe in." And then about the next week, Google said, "Hey, can you come do a Google Talk?" And I thought, "Oh, yeah, that's one of the exceptions to the rule."
Right, but, like, if McDonald's called you and said, "Would you speak for free to us?" McDonald's is a big brand name, we're a Fortune 20 company, we're the biggest restaurant in the world, "Will you speak at our headquarters for free?" Probably wouldn't do it.
Right, because then I'd also wonder, well, why if you make all of this money, why aren't you paying me for my time too? So,
Yeah,
because I find that happens. Sometimes the bigger the company, the less that they pay people or the less they wanna pay because they think you should just do it just to be associated with them.
yeah, and also, there's a bureaucracy where they're divided into, like, 1,000 different groups with different P&Ls, so the budget of the organization within the organization that's asking you to speak might not have a big speaking budget, but they can usually figure out how to get if you push.
Right, right, that they can buy books or they can buy something else and make it happen anyway in the end, so you still get compensated.
I am constantly asked to speak at conferences for free, and they all have arguments why I should speak for free, and then they get upset when I say
Yes.
no.
Yes.
And and it's one thing being like on a podcast for free. There's an audience, there's a lot of exposure. You spend a lot of I'm using the exposure argument, but you get a lot of time to get your real message out. It's not just you're doing something that no one sees. You have an hour and a half to really talk instead of just being on a radio show for 3 minutes or something.
Right. And that was going to be one of my questions today. How do you decide what to say yes to, and how do you decide what to say no to? You wrote The Power of No.
I wrote The Power of No. Okay, let's start with that. So, Amy, so the premise of this podcast really is that I wanted someone to interview me, and Amy is a perfect choice because she's super mentally strong after writing these books, and she's been on the podcast a couple times and knows me well, and I'm excited.
Thanks. And I'm also a therapist, but I'll try to wear my author, mentally strong author hat rather than my therapist
No,
hat.
wear your therapist hat.
Yeah? Okay.
Yeah, I need it.
Game on. So then how do you
Are you a
decide?
therapist or a psychiatrist? Can you prescribe
I
medicine for
cannot
me right
prescribe.
now?
I cannot prescribe medicine, but
If you're a therapist, are you sort of, and not a psychiatrist, are you sort of biased against prescribing medicine because that's not in your what you're allowed to do?
no, I like to work with psychiatrists hand in hand to say, okay, if we're going to prescribe an antidepressant, then we're also going to be working on these skills, or if we're going to be working on anxiety, how can we both work together and hand in hand? I find most people come to me because they don't want medicine. And so sometimes, and I say that's great, let's use medicine as a last resort and let's try to use therapy as a tool first. And then if that doesn't work, sometimes I'll try to talk them into going there just as a way to say, you're so depressed right now, you can't think straight. And it's really hard for you to apply this stuff until you get over that next hurdle. And medicine might be the best way to do that. But I try to use it as a last resort as well.
And why do they call them antidepressants instead of pro-happy drugs? Like, why can't I don't want an antidepressant, I want a pro-happy drug.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
I mean, what would be a pro-happy drug? Is there anything out there that you think would make a patient happier as opposed to less depressed?
I guess if somebody has bipolar and we put them on an antidepressant, that's what happens sometimes is we toss them into a manic phase or a hypomanic phase, but that's
That could
not
be
good
really
either.
bad.
Right. So
I've seen that happen.
that's why it's important to really distinguish between depression and bipolar for that reason.
Yeah, I've seen people on who mostly they had bipolar, but they mostly exhibited the depressive side, so they didn't really recognize that they had bipolar. And the more antidepressants prescribed to them, the worse they got until eventually they went so far on the manic side, they had a psychotic episode.
Right.
So that's the danger of classic antidepressants. If you have like bipolar 2, something like that.
Exactly.
I'm gonna be a therapist in my next life.
Great. Well, I know that's what you originally set out to be, right?
Yes.
Was to get in the psychology world. Back to how do you say no? How do you decide what to say no to? Because stuff comes your way all the time. I know it does, from interviews to opportunities to business investments. How do you decide when to say yes and when to say no?
Yeah, when to say no. First off, this is such a critically important thing for careers and relationships and just every aspect of life. And so I wrote this book, which was a Wall Street Journal and USA Today bestseller called The Power of No. And I remember I got the deal for it the day after the book Choose Yourself came out. Hay House, which is like the self-help
Hmm.
publisher, they called me and said, "We'll do any book you want." And I just said as a joke, "Let's do The Power of Now, but without the W." And they said, "Deal." So suddenly I was doing The Power of No. And then I had to think of what to write about because I don't know if you experience this with the mentally strong books, but I tend to write about the things that I've been historically very bad at because then the process of, it's a great example I like to use is Brad Pitt should probably not write a book, How to Pick Up Women, because nobody is going to relate to no one's going to learn or relate from his experience. But if, I don't know, you're me and you write a book, How to Pick Up Women, more people might pay attention actually, because how did this schlubby guy uh, g- get in the dating world, get any dates at all? So with The Power of No, I think I've typically had a very hard time saying no, and I had to spend a long time figuring out not only what to say no to, but then how to say it because I'm very non-confrontational. Like
Hmm.
my typical way in the past of saying no has been to completely ignore the request forever. And people then will start writing like, "What did I do? Like, where are you?" And then eventually they stop talking to me when I fail to respond. I don't
do this as much anymore, but that was my go-to technique of saying no. So there's several layers, and then there's the other layer, which is at what point in your career do you start saying no? Like saying no is important from the beginning. Like you can't say yes to everything, but when you're in your 20s, you should probably say yes to more things than when you're in your 30s and then when you're in your 40s and so on. Because when you're in 20s, you're still trying to figure out what you're good at and what you can do and what and who your team is going to be for the next 30 or 40 years. So you should say yeses to more things. Uh, I was in my 20s and I was working for HBO, but at the same time, companies were asking me to build their websites. And this is related to what we were talking about earlier. Some would say for free, some would say for money, and I would usually say yes to everything because I was building my resume and my career, and then I wanted to build a business out of it, and uh, uh, each yes gave me more and more experience. It gave me more and more knowledge. Um, but and I would say yes to everything. Like even other businesses. Like one time, some tea company uh, wanted me to pitch them tea ideas, and I just said sure. And I went home and I started mixing different ingredients for tea and flavors, and I don't know. I was just saying yes to everything. As long as it was fast, as long as it was like fast turnaround. Like I wouldn't say yes to some 6-month project that was miserable. Um, but I think now I say no to almost everything. Like you kind of come up with your priorities. So like family and loving relationships are a priority for me. So I never want to demonstrate to my family, for instance, that I prioritize this podcast over them.
Hmm.
Now, if I have a podcast during the day and they suddenly say to me, "Hey, can we go you know, walk to the bookstore," I'll say no because I already have a podcast scheduled and this is the middle of the day and I work and they should know that, work is important. But, I won't prioritize going out with friends in the evening over spending time with them. So I would say no to friends and yes to my kids.
Sure.
So, um, and so let's say priorities are kids, uh, you know, uh, work. So I'm involved in several businesses, podcasts, writing. We're doing this podcast in a stand-up comedy club that am a co-owner of. So comedy's on my priority list, but still I won't prioritize these things over, uh, the important relationships in my life. And I won't prioritize going to a party over writing because writing is on my big priority list. Like I need to be able to write every day. Um, so I think in general, if things go against my priorities, I know it's going to be a fast no. Um, if I have to travel and I really hate traveling, it's going to be a fast no, even if they're willing to pay me. So one time I got asked to go to Chile, the country. The president of Chile invited me, and he had a whole agenda lined up. We were gonna go to Easter Island. We were gonna go to Antarctica. I was gonna get run over by a tank safely, and do all sorts of things. And I forget if they were gonna pay or not, but maybe I was gonna fly on a private jet there, the president's private jet, and I said no to that because I didn't wanna go for 2 weeks to I didn't wanna go to Antarctica, I didn't wanna go to Easter Island, I didn't wanna get run over by a tank, even though the whole thing sounded like an exciting story, which I prioritize a good story so I could write about it. There was just enough things. I didn't wanna be away from family for 2 weeks. Um, so if something is close to where I live, I say yes if it's not too hard and if it doesn't affect my priorities. And money has become less important, and resume stuff has become less important. And then how do I say no instead of just ghosting somebody, as they say? I will just be really honest, and I'll say no, I can't do it. But I don't necessarily give a reason. I don't feel like you should have to give a reason.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's very true. But I think most of us feel like that, at least at first. Like I have to say no because and fill in the blank rather
Oh,
than
and
just no
usually
thinking.
after the because is a lie.
Right, right. It's
So
an
I can't
excuse.
go to your stupid destination wedding in Alaska because my kid's graduating that day. But it's in the middle of February. How could they be graduating? Oh, I messed up my days. So So I just say I can't go.
Right, right, okay. So one of the things that particularly interests me, so I work with a lot of people with anxiety. Most people I work with who have anxiety will say, I can't do X, Y, or Z because until my anxiety's better or I'm too anxious. I have all these dreams that I'd like to do, but I can't because anxiety holds me back, or I have to wait till my anxiety gets better. You've been really upfront with saying, I'm an anxious guy, and here's all the things I do anyway. I can still do stand-up comedy. I can still do this podcast. I still meet with all sorts of people from all over the planet. How do you how do you do that?
Yeah, it's really interesting because anxiety, as you know, as a therapist, can be totally debilitating. And I think anxiety, you would know better than me, but it comes from a lot of different sources. But I would say anxiety for me is linked to, let's say, prior trauma or feelings about self-esteem. So, for instance, I'll get anxious in with with money if I feel like, oh no, and this has happened more in the past than now. But if I'm in a, uh, I think if I don't have as much. I should have a lot of confidence about making money, but let's say 10 years ago, I was less confident. And if I was feeling like in a precarious money situation, I would get so panicked. It'd be like I'm having a heart attack. I wouldn't be able to sleep. I would write on pads all night long, adding up like the money in each account I had or business opportunity I had and try to figure out how I'm going to live. And I just, all of this worry would do nothing. Like worry never really accomplishes anything and just wastes time. And it would just be debilitating. But now with everything I do get anxious about it. Like, let's say I'm about to go, the most extreme example is if I'm about to go on stage for stand up comedy. Public speaking is hard enough, is anxiety producing enough, but then stand up comedy, there's two extra things, which is A, the audience doesn't know you. Usually in public speaking, they know you. And, and B, you have to make them laugh. So
Right.
with public speaking, which is still anxiety provoking. You don't they know you and you don't have to make them laugh. But with stand-up comedy, it's all the things with public speaking plus these two other things, and usually you have shorter amount of time. But I've gotten really anxious with both public speaking and stand-up, and I've experimented with dealing with my anxiety before going on stage with comedy. So for instance, is it better to have a drink or not have a drink? Is it better to um I don't know, have a lot of coffee or not have a lot of coffee, like take a stimulant or not a stimulant? Is it better to uh, take like something anti-anxiety or not anti-anxiety or meditate or not meditate? And I find actually having a mild amount of anxiety is
Mhm.
the best because you're not so anxious that it's ruining you, but you're anxious enough that you're like hyper aware of everything that's going on and you're ready and maybe you're confident. And I usually try to say the anxiety is just a tool. So I distance myself a little from it by acknowledging that it's there, like being aware of it as opposed to just living it. Um, but in general, anxiety has been really hard for me. I always try to say now, what's the worst that could happen? Kind of like the standard things like what's the worst that could happen, and it's not so bad. Like stand-up comedy, ultimately, 30 strangers from Norway who are in the club. Like, who cares if I don't do so well? It's not going to ruin my life. Um, and or when you're negotiating selling a company is another way I get anxious, and I try to really plan in advance like script out all the possibilities of what could happen. And then again, I try to figure out a worst case scenario. Worst case scenario is I have five other options to sell the company. This is just one. And so I'll try to diversify the good experiences in my life. So actually, that's always what I've done. So even when I was day trading, if I had a bad day trading day, I would switch focus completely to something else completely different happening in my life and try to be good at that to reduce the anxiety about the day trading.
Mhm.
So like maybe I would switch to playing from a bad day trading day to playing chess. And if I won a bunch of games of chess, I would be less anxious. So people always say invest in yourself. Um, but they never talk about how you should, just like with all investing, you should diversify. So I diversify the way I invest in myself, and that helps spread out the anxiety or compartmentalize the anxiety. So if three things are going well but two things aren't, I don't have to focus anymore on the two things that are causing me the most anxiety. But when I first had a lot of anxiety, I took Klonopin and got horribly addicted to it,
Right.
and it was just the worst experience in the world. being addicted to that.
And a
And
lot of people don't realize the side effect of Klonopin and those benzos is that it causes anxiety. And so the longer you're on it, the higher you dose you have to take, and it ultimately
yeah, it's really
leads to more
hard to wean
anxiety.
off. Like
Right.
I don't know how people would get off Klonop. I've tried this in the past. Like I started taking it in my most anxious period. I've had several anxious periods, but let's say 2009, I was anxious and I was really anxious about money. And I started taking Klonopin, and I'm like, this is a miracle drug. This is the first drug. Antidepressants never worked for me. This is like it literally almost put up a wall in my head, so my brain wasn't allowed to think an anxious thought, and I took more and more depending on the
Hmm.
anxiety. But then I figured, oh, okay, I don't need it anymore. I started solving my financial problems. I tried to get off, and day one was okay, but then like day one was even great. I had tons of ideas. I felt very creative. But then day two, it's like literally I'm like sitting in a chair and there's like a thunderstorm happening in my head and I'm just like trying to hang on to the chair. Like it's the worst experience in the world trying to withdraw. You have to do it very slowly and wean yourself off over years.
Right, right. And unfortunately, like, a lot of people don't know that when they start taking it. They don't realize how addictive it is.
Yeah. Like if you start off taking like I don't know what it is, 4 milligrams or whatever the measurement is, it's sort of like one half a milligram every 6 months you have to get off.
Right.
So
And tell me about that. I know you've had ups and downs, dark times. Do you worry that you'll ever have those dark times again? Do you think that you will? Or do you feel like now you're better, that you would never go back to the places that you've been before?
uh no, it's like the story of Jay Leno. So Jay Leno does when he was doing his show, The Tonight Show, he would do stand up in Las Vegas every weekend, and that's the money he would live off of is his Las Vegas money. Even though he was making 20 million a year running The Tonight Show, he just put all that in the bank. And because he was so afraid he would go broke if he didn't save every dollar of this 20 million a year paycheck. And so I get a little nervous like that. Uh if bad things start to happen. So let's say I'm involved in a bunch of investments and one day I see, oh, two or three of them are not doing so well. I'll start to feel that anxiety that I felt all the way back in 2000 when the same thing happened. It would bring back like that kind of trauma. The world's not going, I can't control the world exactly how I want. This means eventually I'm going to go broke. But then I just recognize to myself, oh, I've felt this a lot before, and it never I never went, that broke again. And I just sort of remind myself that I've felt this feeling before and it doesn't work.
Yep.
Or if I'm in a relationship and I get anxious about where is she or how come she didn't return my call, I will remind myself I've gotten anxious about this in other relationships before. It never meant anything. And I just always remind myself of the statistics in my past of when those anxieties actually told the truth. Now, I used to run a fund of hedge funds where I would invest in other hedge funds, and sometimes I would get obsessively worried that one of the hedge funds I was invested in was a scam, and I would research everything. Like, it's like almost like I was a spy, and I would call my business partner on a Sunday, and I would say, "I'm absolutely sure this one fund is a scam," and he would like sigh and he'd say, "James, you say this about every other fund." And just call them Monday, ask them questions, and you'll be fine. They'll answer you, and they're fine. And he was always right. They answered me and they were fine. They convinced me and I took a big sigh of relief. I would say 90% of the funds I was worried about actually were scams. And so sometimes what you're obsessive about turns out to be true, but you still have to avoid anxiety so you can deal with the worst case scenarios.
Is it only outside things that ever put you in a low place, or do you ever feel like life could be going well and you'll take a strange dip anyway?
No, so that's sort of the difference between situational anxiety or depression and more
Right.
biological. I never get sort of sad without a reason for it.
Okay. And then you've said before that women in your life will tell you you need medication or that you need something.
Yes.
Do people still worry about you?
Yeah, because uh, I think I think I I get really obsessively eccentric. So, for instance, I'll throw out all of my, a few years ago, I threw out all of my belongings and just started Airbnb around. I didn't have any rental. I wasn't renting an apartment. I wasn't owning an apartment. I just started renting. And some people thought, hey, that sounds really cool and fun. Usually men would say that to me, like, oh, I wish I could do that, but I can't. And women tended to be worried, like, is everything okay? Are you kind of depressed or crazy? And uh, finally it occurred that one of my female friends called me and said, you know what? It's a little bit too creepy now. You've been doing this for years. You should rent an apartment. And she was right, and I did. Uh, and you know, but in general, for some reason, um, I think I don't know if this is stereotyping too much, but I think at least the women in my life tend to be a lot more grounded than me.
Hmm.
And so we tend to split the difference and they get worried if I'm going off too much on some tangent in my life and they want to ground me. Or my daughters will for instance never get in a they've built up this whole mythology that I'm the worst driver in the world, so they'll never get in a car with me, for instance.
And what about now that you have an apartment, you have stuff again? Does that affect your mood? Does that affect your anxiety? Has it?
Yeah. Like buying things makes me anxious. Even though I have the money to buy things, I don't like for years I would not buy anything because I only would own the things that fit in my backpack, so I never bought anything. And now that I have more stuff and I need to buy like a chair or buy renter's insurance, all these things that I've never really done in a long time or in my whole lifetime, uh, it does make me a little anxious that money goes out. Like I think in the modern world, we're moving more and more away from kind of the hourly wage factory system that was created with kind of capitalism. Capitalism and factoryism sort of went hand in hand, and that's really where the hourly wage started. And now we're in a different form of capitalism where income could be a lot more volatile. Like you have to write a book and
Right.
then you get your book in stores and the book has to be good. And so it's a little bit more of a meritocracy that kind of the general global economy is moving towards. Not completely, but in part. And so uh that kind of volatility is anxiety producing. Uncertainty is anxiety producing and a little depressing if you don't make money for long periods of time. And but when you buy things like you have to pay rent every month, you have to do my kids have tuitions, my kids have other like medical expenses, then you have to buy all these weird things just in the course of living life. You have to pay accountants and lawyers and all this stuff. So so money going out the bank happens on a regular basis, but money coming in is very volatile. So that sometimes creates anxiety.
Do you set goals financially? Do you how much attention do you pay to it these days?
I don't set any goals financially. I mean, because most of it's out of my control. Like I try to invest in good. I think process is more important than goals. So, and this is related to the saying yes versus saying no question. Um, if someone pitches me an investment, I'm usually easily convinced that, oh my gosh, this is the best thing ever. And but I have rules, but so I know I have to follow my rules. Whenever I don't follow my rules, I've seen now over 20 years, if I don't follow my rules, I have a 0% success rate. If I follow my rules, I have about a 95% success rate. So I know if I just follow my own process with each thing that I do, and if the process is good and well thought out, then I don't need to have goals. Like good things will happen. So, like last year, for instance, 2017, I had all sorts of financial and career goals. None of them, I achieved none of them, and yet I was the happiest I ever was by the end of 2017, even though none of my goals were achieved and completely different goals unrelated to my original goals were achieved. So I don't really believe in goal setting. Do you believe in goal setting?
To an extent, but like in my case too, I never set out to write a book. I didn't mean to write a second book. It's all just sort of happened because I've taken life been flexible. I think if I would have had a goal and I was really intent on making my goal happen, I could have been so hell bent on that that I missed all these other opportunities that came my way.
Yeah, and like even with a book, you sort of have, in a weird way, you have to have a goal. Like you have a deadline. Like
Right.
the book's due March 1st, and but then I think if you take that goal and just translate it back into process, like okay, that means I have to finish my research by November 1st, and then I have to write 1,000 words a day starting November 1st, and it's not like you have to in November you have to obsess on your goal deadline. You just have to say, how can I make sure I'm following my process today? And
Sure.
I think that helps. Uh, that's better than just blindly setting a goal and forgetting about all the different things you need to do to achieve it.
Yes, I think that makes sense. A lot of what, the things that you do all make sense as you're talking about, even back to when you talk about stand up and knowing what state to get in. If we were to back up to that, oh, that's something that like professional athletes use. Do I perform better with a little anxiety? Somebody backstage might be better off pumping themselves up. Somebody else calms themselves down. It all depends on knowing yourself and knowing how do I figure out what works for me. And in your writing, you've been very clear that you're not a self-help guru. You're not trying to tell other people what to do. You're just saying this is what works for me.
Yeah, because I see. I mean, and you probably see this too, because we're kind of writing in sort of the same industry and same type of audience. So much of self-help out there is just bullshit. And
Yep.
then particularly I see now in the kind of entrepreneurship self-help space, there are so many people giving entrepreneurship advice about how to be, productive and be a leader and do sales, and they've never run a business before. And they're writing all these books and self-help and uh uh I think it's really important that you've experienced and studied the things you're writing about, and that uh, you have a process in place to help you succeed, and that process is more important than the outcomes and the goals. And I forgot what you were saying about stand up.
Just knowing what state you work best in, whether you're better off to be a little anxious before you do it, and just knowing about yourself, and then you share what works for you.
Yeah. Oh, right. So the idea is I only write about something if I've experienced it. So, which means, and usually means, I've experienced it from a real low point, and then figured things out to get to a higher point. But so much self help is like, here's how you be a leader because
Right.
I'm such a great leader, and all of that is like bullshit.
Right.
Like you have to be a bad leader to learn how to be a good leader. I think.
Right. And in your case, though, you share a lot of really personal stuff, and you do on your podcast, what you do in the articles that you write. Do you ever get like a vulnerability hangover where you're all, oops, I shouldn't have said that, or did I share too much? Or is it ever awkward or uncomfortable for you when you do share what's going on in your personal life?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of have a rule where I don't actually publish an article unless I'm afraid I'm sharing too much.
Oh,
So now I don't use that rule 100% of the time, but let's say 90% of the time. So and that does get me into trouble often. Sometimes I try not to ever say anything that will hurt anybody else. That's like the only rule I have. Like I'll say bad things about me, but I'll never say bad things about someone else. Um, but I'll say anything about myself. Just because then people know, okay, he passed the test. He's telling the truth because he's willing to say this about himself. So there's kind of a tactic behind it, but I also don't think it's interesting unless you're kind of sharing your stories and telling a story. People want to read stories. That's how for 70,000 years, that's how humans um spread knowledge, was not through facts like they do in the school system now, but through storytelling.
right. And the first two times I was on your podcast, actually, people came up and I got the same question from people either by email, or I had a couple of people come up to me and ask me the same question about you. Any guesses what people want to know from your guests?
Yeah, is he like that in real life?
Yeah, that's it exactly.
Yeah.
They probably email all your guests to ask that question, but that's exactly it. Or I had people that it was like they knew, but they really just wanted that validation where they say, "He's really like that when the mic's off, right?" And I say, "Yeah, that's really him." And then they seem like, "Oh, I knew it, I knew it, I knew it." And so people obviously feel like they know you from what they read and to know all about your life. But is that ever? I mean, how uncomfortable is that for most of us? I'm a therapist, so I hate talking about my life. I like to talk about other people's problems and solving them. But I share a little bit, but it's really uncomfortable. How do you do that?
Well, you're a professional, right? So you're trained to not talk about yourself. Like you're
Right,
not really allowed to talk about yourself in a therapy session with a patient.
right.
And I'm not a therapist, I'm just a writer. So and I have a lot of experiences that affected me. And since I have no training on helping people other than my own experience, I have to write about my experience uh, in order to help people. Now, the things that I'm naturally good at, which are, I think very few people are naturally good at anything, but there's no point in me writing about them because I don't really know how I got good at the things that I'm naturally good at. But the things that I had to work really hard and struggle to get good at are deeply ingrained in my experience, but I have to tell the story of how I got there, whether
Yeah.
it's starting from, you know, being broke or being in a bad relationship or being suicidal. I have to kind of start with the low point, and there's an arc to that story, similar to any other arc where finally at the end I'm able to come back and tell the story. Sort of the end of the arc of the hero.
And then is it surreal though that people get so enamored? I mean, the New York Times wrote about you throwing out all your stuff. Were
Yeah.
you ever surprised that people were just that interested in like what's James doing next?
Yeah, because like take that New York Times article for instance. Yeah, homeless people are also don't have any belongings. They don't write about every homeless person in the street. For some reason, they were writing about me, and and they used the word self-help guru, and I said, "Don't use that." And the reporter said, "I'm sorry, we had to use it." Like he
Mm,
apologized to me the day of. Um, but then a lot of people wrote to me. Um, Steven Spielberg's company Amblin wanted to do a scripted show based on a character like that. Other companies wrote to me, and uh, I was just trying something, a different way to live for a while because I like to experiment and not necessarily experiment. Like I think Tim Ferriss is a very good experimenter. Like
right.
he wants to live a long and healthy life, as do I do, and many people do. So he'll do body hacks and other hacks. I just kind of experiment on things that make me curious. Like what would it be like to just have nothing and live in Airbnbs? I'm not necessarily trying to improve myself that way. I just want to live. I just want to maybe be a little happier for a while. And so I did it for a few years and then stopped doing it.
Well, then when you stopped doing it, was there any concern that people would lose a little bit of that mystery of
Yeah, I was scared. I was like, "Oh my gosh, no, Steven Spielberg's not gonna wanna do a TV show," or, uh, "People think of me now as this big minimalist. What how am I gonna explain that I live in an apartment now?" And, the reality is you just can't you always have to move on to the next thing, like, you can't let anybody else label you. I mean, people constantly want to label you. Like
right.
for years, I wrote about finance. For the first 8 or 9 years of me writing books, I just wrote about finance, and everybody was like, "Oh, he's that finance guy." Then I started writing about completely different things, like the opposite of finance, like going broke and how to recover, and then just weird stories. And people thought it was crazy, like I lost a big size audience, but then you get a new audience, and so you just have to do what your creative compulsions tell you to do. So, like, not comparing myself to Picasso, but he changed styles like every 3 or 4 years, and would just do completely different things. Andy Warhol, completely different things. I mean, other writers can get away with doing the same thing over and over, but even like you get a guy like John Grisham, he doesn't always write legal thrillers anymore. I mean, his last thriller I think was a kind of a writer's thriller,
Hmm.
and then he's written books about sports, and he's done all sorts of things.
Right. So then, well, and I guess this is coming from the guy that wrote Reinvent Yourself too, right? So,
Yeah, like people feel an urge to reinvent themselves every few years. You get bored doing the same thing over and over again, and you have to figure out new formats and new things that excite you. And some people say, "Oh, you have to focus. Like you have to play the violin for 20 years in order to be the greatest in the world." And maybe that's true, but that's just not for most people. Like most people don't want to do the same
Right.
thing for 20 years.
But and then what about your audience? I mean, you still rank, I checked before I got here on Google, I want to die, I wish I could die. And there's a whole bunch of I want to die kind of phrases that you still rank really high in Google. Do you
Yeah,
get
I've dominated SEO for any suicidal ideation.
so then what kind of email? I mean, you must get emails from people that are in really dark places, right?
Yeah, I get emails from people in really dark places, sometimes incredibly dark, where it seems like someone's about to do something, uh, and there's nothing I can do. I can't even respond to them because, again, I'm not a professional,
Right.
and they need the help of a professional. But I'm not even going to write back and say you need the help of a professional. I don't know what you're supposed to write back, and so I do get a lot of those emails, uh, and really I just stick to writing stories and hopefully they get some insight or inspiration from my stories that eventually lead them to a better outlet for expressing their own pain.
Right.
Sometimes I can answer basic questions like I have this situation in the business, what should I do? And I'll just say this is just what I would do. I would do this. But most of the time I can't really answer.
And when
Did you answer, like, if people I mean, you must get questions from people like, "Ah, should I take this job or that job?" Like, do you ever answer?
Yeah, so I get a lot of questions that are just like advice, which I just explain. I'm not really like Dear Abby. I can't really tell you what to do with your life, but also that I don't give psychological advice online. I'm not an online therapist. There's lots of rules about offering psychological advice via the internet. And then sometimes people will say, "Well, can I call you on the phone?" And no, I can't do that on the phone either. But I just recommend people. Sometimes I just send them to like the Psychology Today website and say there's a directory of therapists. Seems kind of like the go-to response to say if you want to see somebody locally, here's where you could do it. But
Mm.
I get so many questions from people in other countries where they don't have access to that, and I don't know what they do have access to, but they don't have mental health treatment readily available. And that's I think one of the biggest eye-opening things for me is just how fortunate we are here in America that you can go get help if you want to, and if you have health insurance and that kind of stuff. But so many people all around the world who can't even talk about it because it's so taboo over there.
Yeah, and particularly, like, in New York City, like, there's probably more therapists than people.
Right,
So
and oh, I work a lot in New York, and so people will talk to me about their shrink, kinda like it's cool to have a shrink because everybody has one, and you go talk to somebody, and that's great, and it's not a problem. But in rural places where I've worked, it was embarrassing, or there's still a stigma attached to it where it's much more difficult, and partly because 'cause you're probably related to the therapist in town because there's only one, or it's, somebody that you know, and, there's a lot of different issues around that. But hmm. Well, and what about when it comes to comedy? So we know that there's been comedians in the past who say, I do comedy to keep me from being depressed. And then there's been a whole list of comedians who have talked about their depression, but unfortunately, there's been comedians when it comes to suicide and substance abuse too. People ever worry about you? Like, oh gosh, now James is into comedy because he's trying
no,
to
because
pull himself out?
I think and I don't know, um, if this almost started with me or if I'm just a part of it, but it seems like I see a lot of just in the past few months, I've seen a lot of like, let's call them life coaches recommend to their clients, oh, try an open mic at comedy. And I wonder if it's because a lot of people see that I've been all out trying it, and or at least some of them maybe. But I think for me, I just see it as this. I love comedy, and I see it this. I see comedians as kind of like today's modern philosophers, and it's also this incredibly difficult and complex skill. Like no, most people don't realize how complex a skill it is. Like it goes so far beyond just being funny and being able to tell a funny joke that it was just a challenge to learn, and still learning. Like I don't think you ever. It's one of those things you never stop learning.
Right. And yeah, I think for most of us, even who do public speaking, I would be terrified at the thought of doing comedy because we don't have that expectation of making people laugh, and how scary it must be to try to do that, and what a
Yeah, like,
challenge.
in public speaking, if you make someone laugh, the audience is grateful because then nobody else made them laugh, so
Right.
that's great, like, the laugh is just a huge wave of relief for them, and it gives you energy, and you only have to do it once every few minutes, make them laugh to get that kind of response. If you did the same thing in on a comedy stage, you'd be it would be the worst comedy set in the world.
Right. And when you're doing a speech, if they laugh, great. But if they don't, if you have kind of an off the cuff joke and it doesn't really take off, it's not a big deal. You just move on to the
No,
next thing
yeah.
and it doesn't matter. And
And it doesn't stress you out. Like, oh, they didn't
right.
laugh at that. All right, I'm going on. You could even address it. Oh, you didn't laugh at that. I'm clearly not gonna tell those jokes anymore. Like you could meta address it.
And I think you've opened it up to making it clear that it's a skill. I think from a lot of us who don't know a lot about comedy, it comes across that people are either funny or they're not. And one thing that you've done is just saying it clear. There's all of these skills that you learn and you practice and you get better uh, and that you can learn it. And I think it's given us hope for the rest of us that
Well, think about any hard skill. So think about like, for instance, writing. Writing is a hard to write well is a hard skill. We see all these people now writing books uh, that the books aren't that well written, but now it's you can self-publish, and I'm a big proponent of self-publishing, so whatever. But writing well is really difficult, and you think of all you could divide it into all these micro skills. There's uh, did you do the research? Are you did you are you writing without ego? Are you writing where each word is important? Kind of the very in the weeds skills of writing, which is where every line's important. You give cliffhangers even in a nonfiction book. You tell stories. There's maybe 20 different micro skills to becoming a good writer, and each one is a separate micro skill that you have to fully develop. And it's the same thing with comedy, where humor is just one of the micro skills, and then there might be skills like, are you good with um, riffing with the crowd? Are you likable? Which is a skill. Are you is your timing good, which is a skill. Like I've seen comedians in the beginning of their career and now, and you could see the jokes are the same. The only thing that's different is their timing, and they're 1,000 times better. So, and timing is different when you're on stage as opposed to when you're with a group of your friends. So, this I was talking to someone yesterday who's a great comedy writer, and he knows how to construct a joke, but he's not a good performer, so he can never be
mm,
a stand-up comedian, even though he's like super funny, famously one of the funniest people on the planet. And but will never be a stand-up comic because that's a performance also. And in stand-up comedy, you have to be good at improvising. You have to be good at making voices. You have to be good at like acting out some of your joke. So it's all these micro skills that are independent of each other. Chess, you have to be good at the opening, the end game, the middle game, tactics, positional play, all separate skills completely.
right. And do you feel like then, in your case in particular, I mean, that you could learn just about any skill that you could, if you wanted to, go down that certain path? I mean, you did chess, you did poker for a while, and stand up.
Yeah, anything that has kind of like that game like structure, you figure out what the micro skills are, which you could do by reading a lot, trying a lot, and watching a lot. You can figure out what the micro skills are, and then you focus on you kind of compartmentalize those micro skills and try to get better at each one. So um, uh, and it's funny because then when you get better at certain micro skills, you see how it translates to other areas of life. So, for instance, with comedy, very important to not only do crowd work, which means making jokes back and forth with the crowd, but to also control the crowd. Like they can't be on their own doing their own thing. They have to be paying attention to you, and you have to be the most alpha person in the crowd for those few minutes. So that one micro skill helps when I go on television because
Mm-hmm.
if I'm on a panel, so there's the one or two anchors and there might be other guests on the show. If I want to be noticed in the 3 minutes I'm on television with five other people, I have to make sure I'm quote unquote controlling the crowd, which is basically those anchors and those other guests. And so you have to know how to do that in a way that's not rude and that they're not even aware that that's what you're doing. And that's a micro skill in comedy that's unrelated to humor, and it applies to so many other areas of life, like sales, negotiating, um, dealing with employees, dealing with customers, TV, other things.
I think that's important because I think a lot of people go into something, it doesn't work out the first time they do it. They think I'm a bad salesperson, or that wasn't meant to be, rather than thinking I can learn it and that there are skills I can get to gain along the way.
Right. So, I mean, this just relates to 13 things mentally strong people don't do. Like, if you give up the first time you try something, you can't get good at it, even if you're super talented at it. Like I've seen, I was roommates once with this guy. His kid brother was probably the most talented chess player in history. He was 11 or 12 years old, and he was an unbelievable chess player. I have never seen talent like that. And he just rode off his talent. And by the time he was 17 or 18, he was a complete unknown. Like he
Hmm.
just never developed that talent into the. I mean, he was already at the level, just on talent alone, he was already at the level where he was in the top of world's chess players, but he needed to develop the skill to be the best in the world, and he just never worked at it.
Well, that kind of brings me to my next question about success. Do you ever, so you've learned certain skills, you do things, and then you have this other area of your life where you're James Altucher, so you can call anybody you want on the phone to come on your podcast and get a yes, pretty much, right?
Not always. Like Steve Cohen, who's in the audience here, how many people do you write a day
I try
to
and
get on this podcast?
I try and do about 50 or so. I try and like set that as a number. I don't always do that many. And most of them don't say, "Oh no, screw you." They say,
Right.
"Oh, we're not free now. Follow up in a couple of months." Pound sand? No. But and so you have to just keep up with it.
Yeah, people usually have to have like for instance, it's funny. We were just commenting yesterday. It's easier to get a billionaire on the podcast than, let's say, a famous actor, because
Interesting.
they just don't need any more exposure for anything. If they write a book, everyone's either going to buy it or not. Like they don't need any exposure for
Right.
anything. Whereas a billionaire wants to kind of give back to society and spread his or her message. And it sort of depends on what their particular agendas are. So when we write to people, it's not only that we have a good show with a great demographic for their message, we kind of have to understand what their agendas are and write towards those agendas to convince them to come on. Not with everybody, but with like the type of person who doesn't usually go on a podcast. It could be very difficult.
If somebody won't, does that ever get you down, or rejection in general? Do you
No, because we get rejected, let's say up to 45 times a day.
exposure therapy? Once you do it enough, you realize it's not that bad, right?
I mean, if there's somebody I really, really am dying to get on, we will pursue for years. And like Richard Branson, we eventually got on. I really wanted to get Judy Bloom on. She came on. Yeah, Parker Posey, we haven't had on yet, but we're working on that one. And Judd Apatow,
Yeah.
hopefully he will come on.
And then what about the other end of the spectrum? Like, because of your success, do you ever struggle with imposter syndrome? Do you ever feel like, gosh, I don't deserve all of this, or I'm just this guy going through life and I don't deserve to be here?
Yeah, all the time. And I was going to ask you about this. Like, I think self-sabotage is one of the biggest the first time I ever heard the word self-sabotage, I thought that is such bullshit. Like, do people really intentionally sabotage themselves? But I think what happens is that it's like a blind spot. It's like
Right.
unintentional. So at some point in their lives, they lost self-esteem over something. And so whatever that something is, if they're going to get it as an adult, let's say it's money. Let's say they for some reason they don't believe they deserve money, or they were raised in a family where they were taught money's evil, or they were raised to think you're not good enough to make money, just get a regular job and whatever. So let's say they're getting closer and closer to a big payday, like they're selling a company, or they're doing a big real estate sale, or whatever it is. The self-sabotage comes in is the closer they get to the date where the payoff is supposed to happen, the more and more anxious
Right.
they get. And then at some point, let's say the anxiety starts 3 months before the big payday. At some point in those 3 months, they'll sabotage themselves. They'll call up the person who's supposed to pay them and they'll say, listen, just give me half right now and we're good.
Right.
And so they just sabotage themselves out of half of what they were going to make. And then the person might think, oh, well, he was willing to take half. I'm going to only offer 10%. And then suddenly it's a whole different ball game and they ruin their chances and it becomes a legal fight and, boom. Or in a relationship, somebody might think, oh, I'm not worthy of somebody who is a good, nice, intelligent partner. So at first that helps them because, oh, I don't care because I'm not worthy of it anyway. And then they have confidence. But then they realize, oh, somebody does like me, and I'm getting closer and closer to whether it's getting married or having a solid relationship, whatever, they'll do something to self sabotage. Like maybe they'll
Right.
get overly jealous or insecure or, you know, irrationally try to control things they can't control or competitive. And I think self sabotage is a common thing. So and that happens to me all the time. That happens to me in like almost every area of life. So in terms of imposter syndrome, I think that happens to me with everything I do. So you have to just be aware of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And then what do you do when you sabotage yourself? Like, what are some of the things that you
So
do?
so so I notice, okay, this is anxiety that's occurring because I'm self-sabotaging right now, and I just have to sit on my hands.
And how do you sabotage yourself?
Well, I might do that thing where I'll call somebody and like 2 months in advance of a payday
Yeah.
and say, "Listen, don't worry about it. Just give me half right now, and we're all good." So I just sabotage myself, and they might even say, "Why would you do that? Just wait 2 more months, and you'll get the payday." And I'm like, "No, no, no, just okay." Like that's all sabotage, and being, let's say, irrationally jealous or whatever, or thinking that um, oh, my podcast is no good or my writing is no good. Those are harder to self sabotage, but I think relationships and money are big things, or friendships, and I think then you just have to be like, let's take the money thing. I have to be aware. Okay, this is the sort of thing I self-sabotage myself on, so I should just do nothing. Since I don't know where my blind spot might be, I don't know which of my actions are gonna be self-sabotage, I should just do nothing
Mhm.
and sit on my hands as much as possible or deliver value, like, above and beyond
Yep.
what they thought I was going to do. So, I have a technique I call, overpromise and overdeliver. So I'm always trying in those situations to overpromise and overdeliver and ignore the things that I know are somehow related to self-sabotage, even if I'm not mentally capable of connecting all the dots. I know I'm self-sabotaging in all of these areas. So it's going to happen somewhere.
So the more successful you get, do you get more anxiety about, am I worthy of this? Is something bad going to happen?
Yeah, because each new level of success is something unique. Like, let's say you made X dollars 1 year and you were anxious about that. Like, okay, then you got it and then it's no problem. Now suddenly you're going to make 10 times X dollars. Oh, I realize I'm worthy of X, but I'm certainly not worthy of 10 times X. That seems ridiculous. And that's now you're in the game for self-sabotage. Self-sabotage is ready to attack you, and you have to really work. You have to acknowledge in your head, okay, I'm going to self-sabotage myself, and then you have to sit on your hands as much as possible.
And then what about the fact that you can call Richard Branson and he shows up? Do you ever just think like, how did this get to be my life? That I have these people that come in here and they want to talk to me, and somehow I'm making this podcast and people are listening. And
Yeah, like I'll tell you a story. And this is more related to business, but I always had a saying for like a decade. So I invest in a lot of private companies, like angel investments. And I always would tell so I have one partner for my these private investments. And I'd always tell my partner, um, if the CEO of the company is calling me, I'm specifically never going to call him back and I'm going to write that company off to a zero. Because if they got to the point where they went down the chain of their advisors and now they're calling me, then they probably are going out of business.
huh,
Like, and I'm not going to waste my time even responding. But then recently, my partner started responding. He's like, "No, you're wrong. You should call them back because you're actually the person they really need to talk to."
oh,
Because now I've been through 30 years of building businesses and I have a lot of experience and I've been a CEO, an investor, a board member, an entrepreneur. Like I've been involved in big companies, small companies, built companies from scratch, made big companies bigger. So actually now I do have the experience. They should be calling me, but it was hard for me to realize that uh, I was delivering any value at all other than a last recourse before they went out of business. So I had to be told specifically that I'm not as stupid as I normally think. Now I'm still largely stupid, but not as much as I thought.
wait, in your writing, you'll call yourself stupid a lot. Do you think that in your head? Like, will you think, oh, I'm so stupid?
Yeah, because being smart in you can't be smart in every area. So I think my first big problem was after the first time I sold a business, I thought to myself, "Oh, I made a lot of money. That must mean I'm a genius because that's how society conflates money. I'm smart in everything now." And so I would just spread it all around. Like I'm great at this, I'm great at that. I'm going to invest in this. Everything I touch is going to turn to gold. And then I lost all of my money doing that. And so I had to really teach myself not to be kind of arrogant in that way and just remind myself all the time that maybe I'm smart in like one or two areas, but stupid in almost every other
Mm.
area and be willing to learn all the time in every other area of life. And look, as just a typical example, that's how I invest. I only invest in a company if the CEO is smarter than me at that business. And if my co-investors, I have to have co-investors, if my co-investors are smarter and have more resources than me, because it tells me they've done more work than me and the CEO is better than me at figuring out his business. So I don't need to think after that. Like if it's the reverse, if I think, oh, I'm smart, so this is gonna be the biggest trend of the 21st century, I'm gonna put all my money into it, then that's probably gonna be a failure.
Hmm. And then what about people? Because you'll say sometimes that you don't like people, and then
I like you.
thank you. I'm glad. But and then you have a interesting, and from what I've read and from what I know of you, you have an interesting relationship when it comes to humans. I mean, there's been times in your life where you talk about being lonely, and you have times when you reach out to people, and then other times where, like, you'll say you're shy if you go to a party. Tell me about that. How does all of that work?
Yeah, well, let me ask you as a therapist, because this is the same question I've asked my therapist. How many close friends do you think a person should or could have?
5.
I think about 5 is right. Uh, so sometimes I have less than that, sometimes I have a little more than that, but like around 5 for close friends. And uh, I think in general, I'm a real poor. It's hard to say I'm a poor judge of character. I think at times I've either hated people too much right away or liked people too much right away. So I realized, I wasn't as good a judge of character as I thought, one way or the other. And so I try really hard not to judge too fast. But like sometimes I'm just in a situation where like, ugh, I hate everybody here, even though I don't know anybody there. And maybe that's just a way to keep myself safe. I don't know. And then other times I'm also really introverted in the sense that like, I could be social with my friends or in a group where I know a lot of people, but if I'm in a party where or a situation where I have to get to know a lot of people, I can't do it for more than like a half hour to an hour, and then I have to recharge. So introversion in the sense that I don't mind being around people, but I have to recharge very quickly and often. And then in terms of shyness, I act. So
Mm.
I'll just say to myself, I'm gonna play somebody who can just talk to anybody, and then I'll just go up to anybody and talk to them, and that's how I get. But I'm just naturally shy though. Outside of that,
Right. Okay. Huh. And I think people would be surprised by that, right? Because you're James Altucher, you're on your podcast, and you put your story out there for millions of people. How can you not want to talk to people?
well, this is where stand-up comedy or public speaking helps, is that you get used to
Right.
talking to strangers in a very public setting where all eyes are on you. So so that doesn't necessarily help with shyness, except what I'll do is, again, it's using a micro skill in one area and it to apply it to another area. I'll take that same performance like skill, like being able to perform and having a commanding presence, and then I'll be able to go up playing that role. I'll be able to go up to people and talk to people.
How much do you care what people think of you?
Usually 0.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, I want people to uh like I really hate it when I get too much hate, and I for some reason I get a lot of hate, but I also get a lot of not hate. It's just that the haters tend to be more vocal. Uh
Do you read articles about you? Do you read Amazon reviews? Do you read stuff that people say?
I'll read articles that are about me, and some of them are like unbelievably hateful. Like I
Right.
don't even know why they would make up these lies. People, it's even people I know will just make up lies just to get. I don't know. I get a little upset at that. Like, why I would call them. Why did you just say that as a lie? And nobody would ever have an answer for me. And anyway, but in general, I don't really care what people think.
Do you read reviews? Like if people review your book, do you read it?
Not really, no.
Do you still read comments on your blog?
Nah. I mean, unless it's like one of those things. Um, this is how I treat comments on the blog, because that's something I can control. I don't invite someone into my living room if I think they're gonna shit on the floor. So if
Mm-hmm.
someone comes in my living room and shits on the floor, I kick them out. So if someone is just insulting in my blog they're allowed to disagree, of course, and then it's a discussion. But if they just say this guy, he should be dead or whatever, then I'll just delete it.
And
So,
then how do you decide to let into your inner circle if you're somebody that says I'm not always a good judge of character? How do you decide who to put your energy into? You've said you're notoriously not good at keeping in touch with people.
I think yeah, so I'm really bad at keeping in touch with people. Like again, Steve Cohen's here. He writes 70,000 emails a day, keeping in touch with people. I don't know how he has the time to do it. I'm really bad at keeping in touch. I'm really bad at following up on important introductions that I might have even asked for. Uh, uh, but I think over time, because people know that about me, usually people forgive me for it, and they know I didn't have bad intentions. Like, I mean, I've had situations where I've blown off people for years, and then I'll just write and say, "Look, I'm sorry. I was going through something. Would love to have coffee." And then if they're a friend, they're fine. Um, but in general, people show you who they are pretty quickly, and I always listen to who they are. And uh, a classic thing is I was telling a guest this a few weeks ago before this podcast started. I said that if I think, I was telling him if I think someone cheated on their wife, if I even suspect it, I probably won't ask them to come on the podcast.
Mm.
And he made the point that yeah, if they're willing to cheat on their wife, they have no problem cheating you in business. He said that's how he's run his businesses, and he was a very successful guy. Um, and so I think people pretty quickly show you the kind of person that they are. And so my thing is I'm trying not to do the Malcolm Gladwell blink where I can figure someone out in 5 seconds and just wait till someone shows me who they are
Do
because they
you
will show you.
do you ever worry that people like you for your money or that they like you for your fame?
Um, since since I so regularly like go broke, I hope they don't like me for my money because that's like a crapshoot. But I say that I don't think I'm gonna have the same types of problems again. But because hopefully I've learned over time how not to go broke. But no, I think every relationship has its dynamic. Like, do you think people like you because they like the books you wrote? Maybe a little bit. That's how they reach out and get to know you. But then ultimately, I don't think. I think like 20 years ago, when I used to like people for their money,
Uh-huh.
those relationships never really worked out well for me. Like I would get too tense, or I would want something from them, and the relationship wouldn't develop organically, and then nothing would happen, and the relationship would go away. Or if I liked someone for their looks, then those relationships wouldn't work out well either. Those were usually pretty bad relationships.
And how do you when you decide okay, this isn't a good friendship, a good relationship, do you because I know you talk about cutting out people who are dragging you down. Do you ghost them? Do you say something?
Yeah,
How do you cut people
usually
out?
usually I ghost in the sense that I just stop returning all messages, and I don't really mean to. It's just that I don't return the first one, and then they get upset, and then I feel guilty, and then time goes on, and I just never respond to them. But that's usually happens after like a 2 or 3 strikes and you're out kind of thing, where I realize, oh, that was a really bad thing that person did, either to me or to someone else. And if I see that a couple of times, then oh, this is not good for me.
Okay. And then
How do you eliminate people?
Yeah,
Or when do you
sometimes
decide?
sometimes I can be upfront with somebody and say, "Gosh, I don't think this is good for either of us." Like I had a friend that would call and complain about all the bad things going on in their life and repeatedly, and I could offer suggestions like, "Oh, why don't you try this?" And it was one of those, well, the world is terrible, horrible and awful and those things will never work for me, but and I just felt after a while like I was being more of a captive audience of saying, "Okay, I'm going to allow you to complain every day and I'm attending your pity party essentially." So to have to say, I don't think this is helpful for either of us for me to do this and let's try something else. If you want to call and talk about happy things, great. Or if you want to
Do you say that to them?
I have before. And it sort of depends on the
Do they
relationship.
change?
Some people, so I have one friend and we have conversations now, and it's not that like I won't be there for you when you're down or when you're in trouble in life, but I actively want to say I'll walk beside you while you try to fix it. I don't want to just stay stuck in your misery and sort of become codependent in keeping you stuck in your misery or and so I have one friend and that's work that we've been able to sort of work through that and to say, gosh, I want to still be friends with you, but not in a way that isn't healthy for either of us.
See, I think people have to be kind of at the same level in the sense that, let's say you thought the world was miserable and everything was miserable, then you could join in the pity party. You could attend that
Right.
pity party together, and that might be a fine friendship, or at least it might have an opportunity to last longer.
Right.
Um, but I think just like in any romantic relationship or friendship or anything, if you you know in a romantic relationship, you're in romance with the other person. In a friendship, you're friends with the other person. You're not the therapist or the parent. And so if the roles somehow change where in a friendship you go from being the mother and they're the child, that won't work out. Or if you become the therapist and they become the patient for your entire lifetime of your friendship, that's not going to work out. You kind of have to be friends for it to
Right.
work out. Like you do friendly things and they do friendly things.
Right.
And I think people have to be kind of at the same level for those things to work out.
I
And
think
it,
so
and
too.
it doesn't mean you're at the same place in life. You just have to be kind of like, to use a new age term, kind of at the same vibration.
Right. And I think some people don't realize, how much other people can drain your mental strength.
Yeah.
And uh, one of the things I've appreciated about the things that you talk about is how you set your life up to make sure that you don't have certain things around you that just drain your mental strength. And because I think talk to so many people who will say, well, if you're mentally strong, you should, just be able to keep putting up with negativity, or that if you worked in a toxic work environment, you'd be okay. If you quit your job, it means you're too weak. But then I've heard you say stuff like, you used to, I don't know if you don't anymore, that you didn't used to buy Doritos and stuff like that because it took too much willpower to not eat them. So you set yourself up to say, I'm not going to put myself in that situation, or with toxic people, I'm just not going to put myself in that.
Right. The Doritos thing's a great example. Like one of the things that I like about New York City is I can always order out. And so I call this the Airbnb diet because I mostly did this in Airbnbs because I didn't have there was no reason for me to shop for long-term food in the kitchen because I was just moving all the time. So I would always eat out or order delivery. You can't order a bag of Doritos as a dessert from a restaurant. Like they just don't have that on the dessert menu. A bag of Doritos is not on the dessert menu of any restaurant in the world. But if a bag of Doritos is in my apartment or house, I'm going to eat it. Like the entire bag is going to be in my stomach at some point. And so, just because I know me, and so it's the same thing with with friends and what you and the environment you have around you. Like that toxicity is gonna go into you. You're gonna consume it if you're around it. And so it's really important to you know, no person can succeed on their own. It's impossible. And that there's that saying, you're the average of the five people you're around the most. That's really true. Like you have to be around good people all the time. Like if you can make it 50% of the time, that's better than 20%. If you can make it 80% of the time, that's better than 50. I mean, sometimes you have to deal with people you can't help dealing with, but you should try at least 80/20, where 80% is people who are just really good for you.
Yeah, I agree completely. And then how well, I mean, where do you put your mental energy? You only have so much time, you only have so much money, so much resources, so much mental energy. How do you decide where to put it? So you set yourself up for success in lots of ways. So you say, okay, I'm not going to waste my time worrying about junk food in the house, and I'm not going to worry about toxic people being a drain on me. Is there other stuff that you do that sort of set you up for success? Because I think that's really important.
Yeah, I try to be, I mean, in addition to just basic health, because I think that's, you can't be successful unless you're just in general healthy.
Right.
And but that also includes emotional health. So you can't be having, fights all night with a romantic partner. You can't be trying to, uh, you know, control like if you get overly upset about the weather, you're not going to be a success because you can't think that you can control things that that no one's ever been able to control. So I think those are kind of key basic things. But other than that, I try to. I used to say to myself, okay, I'm going to write every day. And like I would tell people, write 10 ideas a day, which I still try to do. But most important is to be creative every day. And I, even though you can't quantify this, I try to be 1% better at that every day than the day before. So even though that's something that's hard to quantify, I try to think that way. And then that compounds. So you're going to, if you're going up against somebody who doesn't do that, you're always going to do better. If you're the type of person who's always trying to be creative every day and try to improve on that every day, where are you going to be 5 years from now? You're going to be 15,000 times more creative than you were when you started doing that, just from the power of compounding 1% a day.
What about burnout though? So many people are worried if you just go and you're always trying to get better, that someday you're gonna burn out. Do you ever worry about that?
Yeah. So I was doing this podcast 3 times a week. And now we've moved down to two. I felt like I was getting a little burned out at three. It was really hard because to do 3 podcasts a week, we had to tape 4 or 5, so we would have a good backlog. And each podcast I would prepare and do, and then come down from maybe 10 to 15 hours. So just doing 3 podcasts a week was a full work week. And then on top of that, I was doing comedy, and I was running a business, and involved in my investments, and involved in my relationships. And so I was getting burnt out. But then just, this now I do two. Comedy I do a little less of. Writing posts, I don't write a post every single day anymore. I did a little bit less of everything. But then what I do now, I'm able to focus again and be 1% better. I felt like I wasn't able to be 1% better every day when I was doing too many things. So that was, for me, the sign of burnout is that I'm not able to do 1% better every day.
And so then was it hard to let go of that? Like, did you have any, oh, I should be able to do that. I should be able to.
Yeah, I'm still going through that because I feel like I should be able to do everything I want to do, but you just can't.
So
Like, I'm sure you have like a million ideas for books, and then you have to decide, where are you going to prioritize, where are you going to put your time?
right, right. And it's all about, again, going back to that. How do you say no to certain things? How do you figure that out?
How
How do
you
you
prioritize. So you have the franchise, 13 things mentally strong, X don't do. And as opposed to writing a thriller mystery,
right.
it's better for you to get the next advance on the 13 things, and then maybe later you could write a mystery novel if that's been your desire all your life.
Right, which fortunately it hasn't. But there's so many things that come, people are like, oh, you should do a course, you should make an app, you should do this, do more speaking engagements. And you really just have to figure out, what do you want to do? It's wonderful to have so many opportunities, as you know, but to then figure out how do you just pick which ones you want to do? Where's your values and your priorities, and how important is the money versus what you do with your time?
You should start a Facebook group, the 13 things mentally strong people do Facebook group, and then everyone could share like their experiences, like and then a community develops. Like, is this, I'm in this situation at work. What would a mentally strong person do here? And then everybody comments and weighs in off of the principles in your book. And
See,
then there's no work for you. You just set up this group, and you could participate in it like anyone else.
you just can't stop sharing ideas, right? When you're the second I've
We're gonna
walked through
keep
the
going.
door, you always give me great ideas. And it's one of those things where you think, well, why didn't I think of that? But speaking of ideas, don't you think, and thank you for that one, because I do think that's an interesting one. Don't you think a lot of people struggle to actually implement ideas? So, for example, when I was on your podcast the second time, we talked about a business idea and e-commerce and how to do it. I got so many emails from people that are like, I'm so going to do this. Thank you so much. This was great. Some of them had questions, and we gave them pretty much everything they needed. And I told every single one of those people, when you set up your website, when you have questions, come back and let me know what you have for questions, or if there's problems, or share your success stories. I never had a single person come back
Yes.
and say anything. Do you think for most people that that is a stumbling block though? They come up with an idea or they borrow somebody else's idea, but then they don't do it. How do you go from thinking about it to actually doing it?
Yeah, I think if well, first off, something has to excite you. So
Mhm.
like, it wouldn't excite me if someone said, "Hey, LeBron James wants to give you basketball lessons." Like I wouldn't really care, so I wouldn't do it. Or even having the idea, I should approach LeBron James about giving me basketball lessons. Like I wouldn't be excited about that. I wouldn't do it. So you have to be excited about something. But I think also you have to figure out two things. So sometimes I come up with a list of ideas of things to do, like books to write, or posts to write, or businesses to start, or ideas for other businesses, or let's say 10 ideas for Amy to do. Um, and then let's say it's business ideas, and let's say one of the businesses I really like. Then I'll think to myself, okay, the next list of 10 ideas are 10 really easy execution steps, next execution steps that I could do to see if this idea is going to fail or not. And that's only if some idea really excites me. Most of the ideas I come up with don't excite me. I'm just exercising the idea muscle. But like, for instance, one time a friend of mine and I came up with an idea over a brunch. He was introducing me to his new girlfriend, and he was saying, and asked him, well, what? And he said, like, we're going. He made he. It was sort of funny. He's in his 40s. He said, we're going steady now. It's like a high school phrase. And I'm like, well, what does that mean in today's world, going steady? And he said, well, we each deleted all of our dating apps off of our phone. So we kind of thought of this idea over brunch. What about an app, a going steady app, where if both sides click on it and link to each other, it deletes all the dating apps off of both phones, and that it informs the other person if anything new happens that is dating
Oh,
related.
yeah.
And so my friend was like, that's a great idea. We should do it. And so that was on a Saturday. And then on Sunday, I went on freelancer.com. I specced out what that going steady app would look like. So I wrote like 10 things that this app would have to have. So that was the spec. I put it on freelancer.com. I said, is there anybody out there who can program this for me? I got back about 30 responses from India and Malaysia, software companies there. And I had one basic question, which is, can an app see the other apps on your phone? Because you have to be able to delete the dating
Oh,
apps.
right.
So you have to say, oh, Tinder's on the phone. I'm going to delete Tinder. Um, and so that was just the one question I had for everybody who responded. And the response I got was, you can do it on Android, you can't do it on Apple. So the idea was a bad idea, and I stopped it. So we came up with the idea Saturday. I spec'd it out Sunday morning. It was very easy for me to post it on freelancer.com. I had one basic question to see if people could implement it or not, and then they couldn't. So it's a bad idea. Um, as opposed to my friend, called him Monday, told him what I had done, and he's like, "Well, I did nothing." So, but I was able to see and learn something. Now this is useful information for any apps I might want to do in the future, or due diligence I have on other apps. And I was able to fail fast, and I learned something from it.
And why do you think that? Because, I think so many people say, oh, I don't know, they come up with excuses to not implement ideas.
Because they come up with, because they're looking at the goal rather than the process. They're
Mm.
looking if you were to say, I want to write um, a line by line analysis of the Bible, and uh, you start thinking of all the research you would have to do, and all the different things to get you to finish it by the end of the year or whatever, it'd be too big. You would never start. If you just think, okay, well, I'm going to start with the first 4 lines of Genesis and see how that goes, you would be able to start. And if it's like not interesting, you'd say, okay, that's a bad idea, and you'd stop. Uh, but like, for instance, when we had you on the podcast talking about your business, those that's an easy to implement type of business. Not trivial, but there are next execution steps that aren't so hard.
Right.
Okay, register a domain name. Pick a category to sell in where you can buy cheap from here and sell expensive there. Like and you don't have to know the category that works. Pick 10 potential categories: pets, jewelry, handbags, makeup, books, whatever. And then you can start the research. Uh, and so you can come up with 10 easy to execute steps, no problem. But people don't do that. They focus too much on, oh, this is too much work for me. And I have to make the mortgage every month and take my kids to school. And they don't think of these easy to do. Like the entire time I spent on that Going Steady app was probably 15 minutes altogether, 20 minutes, 5 minutes to outline it, 5 minutes to post it on Freelancer, and 5 to 10 minutes to ask a bunch of questions to people who emailed me back.
Yeah, I run into a lot of people who will have a to-do list, and if they checked off the things on their to-do list, it would be like 12 minutes. And make a phone call, do this really quick, do that. But sometimes I think we talk ourselves into thinking it's bigger, harder, or something that we can't do. And that, for instance, these people that had emailed me, they all sounded so excited, and this is going to be great and wonderful, and I can't wait to do it, and it's extra income, and then they don't. And that had happened in my real life too, that people would ask me about it. I'd tell them everything they needed to know. I was excited about it. They would sound like they were excited about it, but then people don't do it. And so I think you're a wonderful example of somebody who says, okay, not only am I an actual idea machine, but then you pick and choose which ones to do, and then you actually go do it.
Yeah, and like a lot of things, like for instance, it's really hard to write a novel. Novel seems like a big, hard thing to do. But if you write 300 words a day, which is about 2 or 3 paragraphs, and you could write 300 words a day on if you're on a subway commute or a bus commute, it's just 4 or 5 stops. You could write 3 or 4 paragraphs. And you can do that every day instead of just reading the New York Post or some gossip column or playing some game on your phone. You can write 300 words a day, no problem. Everybody in the world can do it. Nobody doesn't have enough time to write 300 words a day. You would have, uh, 100,000 words in a year, which is bigger than the average novel. So you would be able to write and rewrite a novel in a year, and you could do that every year. Let's say you have another 40 years to live. You could write 40 novels if you only wrote 300 words a day.
Right.
And so there's nothing out there that you can't do the easy steps. So even take like stand-up comedy. In any town, some bar has an open mic night that nobody goes to, so there's no real reputation risk. And you could just go at 6 o'clock at night to some bar where there's 4 other people listening, and you could try some stupid jokes that won't work. And you just did it. You just did stand-up comedy for the first time. And so there's nothing no that everything has easy first steps that you could do.
And all the things that you talk about are, as a therapist, these are all in line with things that we try to get people to do. But so to recap, when it comes to rejection, you just do it. Exposure therapy for rejection. It's not that bad. When it comes to doing something that's anxiety provoking, you figure out what state to get your body in. A little bit anxious is best for you when it comes to stand up. So that works for you. So for somebody else to know when they're doing something anxiety provoking, are they better off to be excited, or should they meditate to calm down? So that's a good one. And then, we talk about just accepting I'm sort of an anxious guy, and that's okay. I can do these things
Yeah, and,
anyway.
and knowing where you're going to be anxious so that, like, for instance, I might not know how I'm going to self sabotage myself in a situation, but I know I will try to, like, my brain will try to. So making sure that I sit on my hands rather than take some impulsive action, that for me is key in recognizing. Some people won't, you have to kind of prepare in advance for self sabotage.
Right.
Otherwise, I'll just do the self sabotage.
So, yeah, so admitting that you are likely to self sabotage and then to say, how do I prevent it from happening? And then you set yourself up for success. So you say, I don't buy the Doritos. I separate myself from unhealthy people so that I can have a successful life. And then you focus on the process rather than having these clear cut goals so that you're not either a complete failure or a complete success. You just say, what's the process? What else? There's lots of things that all of these little skills that you probably, maybe but that we often teach in therapy, but boom, 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 boom. And you've described them and how they implement in your life. So even though you say, I'm not a self help guru, but this is what works for me, I'm not surprised that it works for other people too, because those are all strategies that work for lots of different things in life.
Yeah, and the only reason I don't ever portray it as advice is because I just think it's for me, I like to write, so it's much more interesting for me to tell it as my own story, like my own horribly shameful and embarrassing story, and then how I learned from it. So, uh, but yeah, I mean, that's why I enjoy writing. My only problem now is my anxiety now is I've kind of written about going broke uh, in 5,000 different ways. Like I used to, for 7 years, maybe I wrote an article every single day. So that's, over 2,500 articles. And a lot of them had to do with failure and bouncing back. And I would legitimately try to slice it in different ways. Like there's different things to look at. Like if I failed at money, how did it affect my relationships? How did it affect, my drugs I was taking? How did it affect jobs I had or homes I own? Like I sliced and diced my experiences in so many different ways. My anxiety now is, what do I write about? So then I would write about pop culture things that excite me and why and how it fits into my ideas. But I think a challenge for me is to find new outlets for creativity. Even though I enjoy writing so much, I have to sort of dip into new resources somehow, and that's been kind of a stumbling block for me.
Do you ever worry if you're successful and you stay successful, like people won't be as interested in watching what happens to James next, or if you can't always talk about failure, that people won't be able to relate to you as much?
Yeah, completely. And I study other people who get through that hurdle successfully. You see some comedians who are obviously super successful, but they're able to still relate to audiences, and I study how they do it. Um, but I think that's a challenge too. I don't get worried as much as that, as I see often people who have been super successful for 30 or 40 years. It's in their brain so much that they're successful and that they're either billionaires or famous or movie stars or whatever, they don't really know anymore how to connect. They've lost the ability to connect to the average person. So I think that's more of a danger than not being able to relate people, is not being able to even know remotely how to relate to people. Um, but for me, I am always just trying to find material. So everything bad is copy. And so you still want bad things to happen or bad things to analyze. But I don't like ranting about political opinions. I don't like, doing all the garbage people do on Facebook all day long. Um, so yeah, I always get worried. What's the next source of creativity? What else can I try to keep learning?
Right. And the fact that you stay, I mean, again, people always ask, is that what James is really like when the microphone's off? But that they feel like they know you just from the way that you write.
I
And
always
then
tell people I'm much more disappointing in person. Because then when I write, I'm always like in the gutter in the beginning and
right.
crying and whatever. And then by the end, maybe I figured something out, maybe I didn't, but it's still a little disturbing. And I think I'm a little bit less interesting like than that in person.
But what was I just listening to? Oh, the story that you told about you were going to pretend to be psychic on the airplane because
Yeah.
somebody's name.
Oh yeah.
The stories that you tell sometimes are, kind of like a little bit things that I wouldn't expect to them. Then when you tell a funny story like that, but it's like you invested all this time into pretending that you were going to be psychic if you ran into this one particular person. Um,
And that worked. And then, I mean, I got to pull off the prank. I forget which podcast I talked about that in. I forgot. I pulled off the prank to such amazing success, and the guy was not phased at all, and I couldn't believe it. Like, literally, I proved one or two things to this guy. I either proved the complete existence of God, or I proved that I must be the most disturbing person in the world, and one or the other. But he wasn't phased at all, even though it was so amazing, the prank. But
it
anyway,
was
yeah.
funny to listen to. And so then, well, I guess one last question: do you worry about what's next? How do you decide what's next with so many opportunities, so many things that you could do? How do you?
I'm just always trying new things. So I believe in what I said earlier, which is invest in yourself first, because that's where you get the greatest returns, which is a cliche, but it's true. But what people don't add is, like, you have to treat an investment in yourself the way you would treat any other investment, which means diversification, risk management, and all the other, due diligence and all the other things that come with investing. You have to apply that also when you invest in yourself. So many people say, "Oh, invest in yourself. That's so important." But you got to treat it like a real investment. And so I diversify the investments in myself. So I'm always thinking of new things I want to try and do and experiment with. And then that's why I have to kind of also limit the time. I have to make sure I'm never fully 100 hours a week booked.
Right, and finding that balance, but I think your audience is eager to know what's James doing next.
Yeah, I don't know, because I don't think of the so I write down each day what things I can do next, and, We'll see. I'm thinking of reality show. What do you think of this idea?
Mm.
So this is the idea, and you're connected to this a little bit in the sense that from our last podcast. So in our last podcast, you gave a strategy by which anybody could make money and build a lifestyle business or more from home. And so I have this idea for a reality show. People could still if they want, but they're not going to. Um, the idea is I will teach you to be a millionaire. And I take 10 random people off the street and I give each of them a different strategy. And I follow the course of their lives over the course of a year. And I get bring in celebrity coaches like guests who have been on my podcast and stuff. And over the course of a year, I either make most of the millionaires or on the way to a millionaire, or some will fail, and we'll see there'll be drama around that. And I think that's a fun show. You think that's a good idea?
I think it would be great. I think people would just be enamored to know, can the average person become a millionaire just with, a few changes? What would it take? How do you do that? And how would you help somebody do that?
And then also, how do people fail at it? Like, because there'll be
Right.
different personalities of the people I pick, and some of those personalities might be better suited, some might be just horror stories, uh, but all of them starting from scratch. I would give them a completely new strategy that they had never done before, and one of those strategies, for instance, might be the strategy you use. Another strategy, I don't know, whatever. I'll keep those close to the vest, and uh, but I'm convinced I can. It was really a test for me. I'm convinced I can take anyone off the street and make them a millionaire. So that's an idea I've been debating.
I think it'd be fascinating to watch then. Is it a motivational issue? Does somebody have an impulse problem? Do they self sabotage? Do they, right? And then the people who do become successful, what was it that helped them? Yeah, please do that.
Yeah, I wonder if I should do it as a podcast or a TV show or a book.
I feel like people would want to know the characters. They're going to want to see them like on
Yeah,
TV
I
and
feel like
watch it.
TV is the best. Then okay, then you have to ask, well, TV, there's so many people in the way between you and the decision and the money. Maybe YouTube is the best way. I don't know.
Right. Well, I heard Instagram just came out with a
Yeah,
TV and
IGTV.
right.
So there's all these possibilities. So okay, so here's a great example though. The first step would be I could figure out the strategies. The second step could be maybe I figure out 3 or 4 people to start this with. And I start this as a little bit of a YouTube series. So I could just start videotaping and interviewing people and giving them the strategy. And I can do that within the next week. I could literally start this project within the next week. And so that's an idea I'm debating.
Right. Because I think for most of us, we'd think, oh, I'm going to start a TV show someday. And then someday never
It's
comes
hard to do
to
a TV
fruition.
show.
So, right. And we talk ourselves out of it. So, when you just come up with that and then you think, okay, what are the steps and how do I get that going? Then, yeah, if you're going to start a TV show in 1 week, game on.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to do it.
Okay, we're going to hold you to it now.
Well, Amy, thanks so much for coming on my show to interview me.
Think it, there's as a
Was it
human.
hard to research?
And no, because there's stuff everywhere about you. But as a human being, clearly you're fascinating. Forbes calls you the most fascinating human on earth, something along those lines. But then as a therapist, of course, well, what makes James tick? How do you do these things when you say, okay, I have anxiety and I've been in at the low points in my life and I've been suicidal and yet here I am and I'm still putting myself out there and still doing hard things instead of just saying, okay, I'm successful. Here's how I did it and offering advice. You're still saying, I'm learning new things. I'm doing stand up. And I might go broke again. And I think that's wonderful that you're willing to put yourself out there and let us go along for the journey rather than just making money off of telling your story and not doing anything new.
Well, thanks again, and as usual, I look forward to your next appearance when you're getting ready to publish the next book, 13 Things Mentally Strong Women Don't Do. I super enjoyed the first 2 books, 13 Things Mentally Strong People Don't Do, and then 13 Things Mentally Strong Parents Don't Do. As a parent and a person, I benefited. I really thought there was a lot of overlap between your ideas and stuff that I've explored and talked about, and I'm so excited to see this next book. I'm gonna give it to every person I know, not just every woman I know.
Thank you. That's what I hope happens. I hope lots of men read it too.
Yeah, because they have to understand the women better.
Exactly.
Like, what's gonna be the difference between women and men?
Well, I try to really pick out some of the things that women in particular struggle with about whether it's some self-esteem kinds of things and confidence issues and
Mm.
imposter syndrome is something I talk about in there, but things that sort of as a society that we've grown up a little bit different in cultural issues and also just how women can push back against some of that stuff.
I can't wait to read it.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me again.
Hey, thanks for listening to the James Altucher Show on YouTube today. I have more great episodes for you every week. Please don't forget to click my face right now and subscribe to the show. More episodes are here, more episodes are coming. Thanks so much for watching.